Absolutely.
Good. And what we're going to talk about is actually net zero. And what does it mean for all of us? I first gave this talk, a different version of it, back in January before the virus hit. And of course, much has changed, but lots is similar. And the thing that is similar is really the answer to the question is everything needs to change. Let's be careful what we think we're talking about. What's the difference between net zero and carbon neutral? And these terms are bandied around. And I was certainly guilty of bandying around carbon neutral and net zero interchangeably. And nowadays they're sort of not. Carbon neutral tends to refer to individuals, organizations, companies being themselves carbon neutral. Whereas net zero tends to refer to countries, or in fact the globe, being carbon neutral. And that means net zero emissions. So if you're a positive emitter of CO2, it means you've also got to have some way of reducing that. So with those definitions in mind, let's talk about what we're going to talk about. And I'm going to go through this at quite a canter. So quick question, Donnie, how long would you like me to take over this?
Well, it depends whether we're doing questions throughout. We thought initially, Peter, roughly an hour. If it goes over, that's fine. But if it was just presentation as quickly as you can, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then we chat about it, it really is pretty flexible.
Okay, I think since there are quite a few of us, let's do pressing questions as we go through, shall we? I'm very happy with that.
Yep.
Okay.
First of all, we have a posh French expression, the tour of the horizon. There's been lots and lots of work done at a top level by various government bodies, and I've got a list of those at the end for anybody who's interested in more detail. And I'm sure some of you have actually looked at this in detail first and already on it. What we'll be talking about is UK focused. This is actually, I've called it a monumental project and change process, and it is, because since really everything has to change, it's monumental. There is very little understanding, I think, in business and in the public of the consequences of being carbon neutral and what has to change on the way. It's not just a little extension of, well, we'll do a little bit more of this and a little bit more of that. Almost everything we look at needs to be different. So, the three takeaways, which on reflection is a horrible American expression, but there you go. I used to work for Deloitte, where I was the director of strategy. So I picked up some Americanisms on the way, for which I duly apologize. The first one is, yeah, you could be carbon neutral in organization X, but in actual fact, the needed reductions are outside the control of individuals and companies, but are going to impact them anyway. I.e., yeah, be carbon neutral, but the reductions are going to come from 2 or 3 major things that happen at the national and global level. Probably the major one, as you think about it, is the role of hydrogen in the economy, and it keeps on popping up in nearly everything which I've got material on here. Third point I'd like to make is, if you think you could start, tomorrow, actually starting now would be a good idea. And you'll see why in a moment. So, what's actually been happening in carbon emissions? So this is from Bayes, and you can see there's a very good line going down, and that is power. Of all the industries, we have massive reduction in carbon emissions through the power sector. Nearly everything else, except for industry, has been pretty much constant. Maybe waste has been pretty good. Industry reduction, I think, has mostly come from the reduction in industry, which is not helpful. So let's look at these sectors one by one. These are the levels back in 2017, and taking here the largest first, which is surface transport. Now, we're all aware of electric cars and electric vehicles, and there's a lot going on there. And people say, oh yeah, it'll never take off. And then they go, well, looks like they might be taking off. And wow, they are taking off, whoa. And then you get to a stage of, they did take off. I wonder when the last people would switch. So this is called the S-curve. And again, I'm sure you're all familiar with it. For the mathematicians around the, I can't say around the table, mathematicians here, there's some very, very simple maths which describe this. It's called P over 1 minus P. I could talk about that quite a long time. But it's a way of looking at the penetration of one product into another product, or a new something into an old something. And when I ran the numbers on electric vehicles in the UK, the electric vehicle market is indeed following an S-curve. And we probably will be able to have 100% electrical vehicle sales by about 2035, which I think is the target. So we're on track there. Of course, it raises all sorts of issues, as well as, well, when are we going to charge it? You've got to have payment systems. You've got to have all the charging infrastructure. Smart charging is something we'll come back to in a moment. Where are you going to charge? At home, in the street? There's flyby charging, which, again, I'll come back to in a minute. Induction charging, plugs, sockets. What are you going to do with the batteries? Do you swap them in and out? I was at a very interesting conference a little while ago, which was a venture capital conference in the States. And somebody there had invented little, very, very small batteries in round balls. And they could interconnect with each other. And you could literally dispense them like petrol from a dispenser into a tank in a car. And because they interconnected with each other with some smart electronics, they could actually run the car. So when you rolled up to your recharging station, you press the button and dump all these little batteries into a hopper and then refill with new batteries. I don't think it'll take off, but it's a bloody good idea. But we need some ideas like that to make charging easier. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen these, but certainly around us, I live in Putney in southwest London, we're getting some of these Siemens charging points, which are a brilliant idea until you sort of think about the reality of it. Again, these are not insoluble problems, but they're problems which need to be addressed. Chargers vary in size from, a couple of kilowatt up to well over 100 kilowatts. And you can see there, I've put out rapid chargers, fast chargers, slow units, and so on. When you look at EV battery capacities, for example, a Tesla S has an 85 kilowatt hour battery, which weighs at 540 kilograms, please note. And Nissan Leaf, somewhere between 40 and 62. If you were to charge those with a 2 kilowatt charger, well, the Tesla would take 42 hours to charge, a Leaf would take 20 hours to charge. So that's not going to work. But fast chargers in the street, if you're lucky, you get 7 kilowatts or 14 kilowatts. Well, what about a street charger in a lamppost? Well, supposing you've got just 10 lampposts down a street, you'll need about, let's say, 100 kilowatts to charge 10 lampposts at 10 kilowatts. Well, lamps used in street lights vary in size, but generally speaking, they're somewhere between 35 and 250 watts. Generally, the average is about 80 watts. So the circuit capacity is about 1 to 2 kilowatts. So the street needs to be rewired. And of course, if you're going to charge from your house, you need to upgrade the supply for a rapid charger. If you've got a 125 kilowatt charger, you probably need a 2-phase supply to the house. And then, of course, the distribution system needs to be upgraded, and so on and so on. And we'll come back to the amount of power needed to do this, but it's quite dramatically increased. So you might charge at home, you might charge in the street, you might charge with inductance charging. This can be done already. So anybody here live near Milton Keynes? Well, if you go to Milton Keynes, one of the bus routes there has a battery bus system. They're quite neat. At the end of each of the route, so it's a end-to-end system, there are inductance plates, and they drive the bus over the inductance plate, sit there for 20 minutes, and it gives the battery enough charge to get to the other end of the route. They charge them overnight, so they've got a full top-up. Needless to say, the genius scientists thought, oh, how are they gonna get the bus over the plates? We're gonna have video cameras, all sorts of electronics. And the bus driver just said, well, why didn't you ask us first? All we need is a hole in the floor, and we can see where we parked. Anyway, that aside, charge on the move is very much what people are working on here. And that entails putting large cables down the center of the road, because you can imagine how much power is needed if you're going to charge all the cars passing by. Which brings me back to smart charging. If you don't have smart charging, then you need an enormous amount more electrical generation capacity. So what smart charging is you have a little bit of software on your household meter, which negotiates with the distribution company as to when you can charge. So you plug your car in overnight, and when there is enough capacity and the price is right, then your car charges. So rather than everybody coming in after work, if we ever go to work again, and then massive increase in demand for electricity because you just plugged it in, you plug it in, and then the system itself thinks, right, well, will flatten the demand curve. And that makes a difference of capacity needed of somewhere around about 20 to 30 gigawatts, which is an enormous amount. And of course, if you've got a highly renewable based generation system, you need bucket loads more capacity. Commercial vehicles will be moving pretty soon to electric. You've probably seen a few electric vans around. Interestingly, this company called Arrival, and the headline said it hums into life with an order for 20,000 vehicles from UPS. And surprise, surprise, in the paper today, they're valued already at 3 billion euros, and mixing their currencies, they raised $180 million as of today from one of the big fund managers. So that's a go. London taxis are, of course, now electric. All the new taxis are electric. So there's a lot of activity. What about big commercials? Well, HGV manufacturers have been testing for several years, and you can see those. There's Mercedes on the left, there's Peterbilt in the States on the right, top right, Scania bottom left, bus company, I think is Volvo maybe, or Scania again, bottom right. Which rather begs the question, what are they actually going to run on and how do you charge them? Well, needless to say, the Chinese have got there first. You know, if you think we're ahead of the curve, we're miles behind the curve relative to what China's up to. Shenzhen, everything's electric. All the taxis are electric, buses are electric. It's just a different world out there. I was lucky enough to be invited to speak at a conference out there last October. It seems like a decade ago. But they're all electric. They've done it. They've been there. So how would you recharge these heavy electric vehicles? Well, the answer is you probably won't. People are testing pantographs. Well, we've all been on trains, and how often is it that the overhead wires come down? So that isn't a train which is reasonably well engineered. You're going to then have a bunch of drivers from all over the world popping onto the system, putting the pantograph up and ripping the cables down. The cables are going to be on motorways. The cable is going to come down, snake all over the motorway, instant jam, electrocution. In my view, that is a total non-starter. Can you carry enough batteries? No, they're just too heavy to give the range. You know, they need 600-700 mile range, these things. But what they can do is just add hydrogen. So you need hydrogen, and you need it wherever the trucks are. You need hydrogen at truck stops, at base, wherever. Which brings us back to my little overworked visual there. We have some questions. So where we're going to get the electricity that we need to generate to run all these vehicles. Are we going to use hydrogen? What other carbon neutral fuels could we use? Whoa, think of this. Think of all the tax we pay on petrol and diesel. So we stop using petrol and diesel. Currently, the amount of money raised on fuel tax is £28 billion a year in the UK. Where is the Exchequer going to raise that money from? Nobody's answered that yet. What are we going to do with all the old batteries? Partly, what's happening now is old Tesla batteries or old Toyota batteries, you can actually take them, stick them up on a wall in a pack and use them in combination, for example, with your photovoltaic cells as home storage. That, you know, they're good enough. They're good enough. But there needs to be serious recycling. All these electric vehicles are rather quiet. What are we going to do about making some noise? One of the famous film music writers, whose name temporarily escapes me, is employed by BMW to write the noise that will go with a electric BMW, because it's the law that you have to emit a noise up to 18 miles an hour in future. And of course, there's lots of pollution still from the tires and from the brakes. So that's vehicles. And what about buildings? Whoa, gets a bit complex here. Heating the homes and offices is a huge consumer of energy. So this is a picture from New Scientist of the home of the future, which of course is fine if you're just talking new homes with green roofs, timber frame construction, because they're, you know, not biodegradable or not. Lots of insulation, car charging points, ground or air source heat pumps or some mixture, lots of double glazing. That's what you can do with new houses. But of course, the vast bulk of the housing stock already exists. So what are we going to do about the housing stock? It's got to be retrofitted. Slightly complicated chart from a company called Element Energy. And it says here, there are, for existing buildings which are on the gas grid, you can, there are what they call multiple pathway options. But, you know, to save you looking through this, there are two options. You can either go all electric, or you could have hydrogen. In the meantime, you can add a little bit of hydrogen to the gas grid, but eventually you have to switch the gas grid to a hydrogen grid. And not to jump too far ahead, if you have a hydrogen grid, because the hydrogen atom is rather small, it has this unfortunate tendency of leaking out of all the old pipes. So you need to stick in new plastic pipes. So there's a bit of a job to be done. Not only a bit of a job to be done, but you need to convert all the housing to either hydrogen fuel boilers, unlikely, maybe. Let's have a more detailed look. Heat pumps are the flavor of the year, frankly, either a ground source or an air source heat pump. So I suspect most of us around here are lucky enough to have our own houses, or certainly a flat with an exterior wall, because if you're going to have an air source heat pump, you need to have an outside wall through which the machine can exchange heat. The heat pump is just a refrigerator in reverse, and they're reasonably efficient. You can't actually get a very high temperature, so you probably need a little bit of a boost to get that very high temperature water, which everybody needs. So you're probably going to have some sort of heat pump in the interim with a gas boiler system, maybe with a little bit of hydrogen top up or an electricity top up. So, you know, converting houses is going to be a big job. Now, we have a boiler here. It's a gas boiler, nice methane gas boiler. And I asked the guy who, or the company which services it, I know they're a good company. They're called the London Heating Company. You'd expect them to be reasonably well wired up. And I said, well, I asked, can you put in a heat pump? To which the reply was, what's that? So there is a big education process needed so that even, you know, well-endowed installers can actually say to their customers, hey guys, you need to be thinking about heat pumps rather than just replacing your boiler. That's a big issue. Right the way down the value chain, things have to change. If you're out in the country and you need to heat the house, what do you do? Right at the moment, we're fortunate enough to have a house down in Dorset, and it runs on kerosene. Well, that's not a goer in the future. So what are we going to do? We can either switch to all electric, or we can use posh term biomass, basically sustainable stuff, you know, chopped up wood from wherever you get it. That has to change. And thinking about buildings in general, the thinking about buildings needs to change. So this comes from a very well-regarded company, HTA Design, and they talk about what they do. They do master plans, suburban stuff, urban stuff. And as a side thing, they think about carbon neutral. In my view, you can't think about all of those 8 things without also thinking about being carbon neutral. What do you know, if you're renovating, what are you going to do? If you're building new, how do you make this stuff carbon neutral? How do you cope with hydrogen or 100% electricity? And so on. So that was building heating. What about industry? Well, actually industry, that funny thing, GVA is gross value added, which is the value of output. And that's a track over time. So actually industry has not been too bad. By far and away, the majority of the emissions from industry are in combustion, which is in furnaces for various things, in glass making, and things like cement. Cement making is a huge consumer of energy, and that is a real problem. One of the members of Atkins 7 has got a little business making a carbon dioxide absorbing process in conjunction with the cement industry, and we should get Donny, you should get John Pilkington to come and talk to the group, because these sorts of things are needed. But industry needs to think about using, well, what? Electricity or hydrogen? Because really those are the only 2 options that we have. So those are some of the sources of emissions from industry. And again, you'll have a copy of these slides and can look at those. Aviation and shipping. Well, this is an easy one. Aviation could be quite difficult. You probably noticed there's prototype airplanes starting to fly around with batteries. Well, of course, since I did this slide, aviation has ceased to be such a large emitter of carbon dioxide since nobody's really flying very much. But that's a short-term issue, I hope. They have an initiative to think about sustainable aviation, and they're talking biofuels, which is literally growing plants to make fuels, which will then emit carbon dioxide, and hopefully then you'll grow more green stuff out of which you will make biofuels. And they say, well, we'll make fuel from rubbish as well. So we'll have electric planes, and we'll operate them smarter, and we'll plant trees. There was a quiz, I think it was only yesterday, and the presentation, Donny, from the AMP, was it AMP presentation? You know, how much do you need to grow? You need to grow in 1 year about the size of Greater London in trees to mop up the carbon dioxide emitted in the UK or something like that. It's just a ginormous quantity of tree planting. There's another figure in the Times today, I think, which was we need to replant something like 1/3 of the world with natural forestry to recover all the carbon dioxide we've emitted. So aviation is a problem. Probably not an insoluble problem. I think it will become more expensive. Will we fly as much? Well, not with the virus flying around. And interestingly, Heathrow's disbanded the team thinking about the third runway. That's not on the agenda anymore. Shipping, whoa, what are we going to do about shipping? So there's all these liners, most of which are laid up, but there's bulk container carriers and all sorts of old ships chugging around the world, emitting vast quantities of noxious fumes. I used to work in the oil industry, and the fuel of choice for a tanker or something like that contained 3.5% sulfur, which when combusted made sulfur dioxide, which is an extremely unpleasant chemical. There are no global standards for the emission of stuff. Luckily, I think most fuel, it used to be called F28, I think most fuels are now about 1% sulfur. But like it or not, all these ships are going around emitting carbon dioxide. So what's going to happen to them? The only answer is actually to run on hydrogen. So the hydrogen, here's a picture of the Orkney ferry. The reason it's in Orkney is because of the European Marine Energy Centre there, which is the test centre for marine renewables. So they've converted a ferry there to run on hydrogen, which is generated from renewable electricity generated at the European Marine Energy Centre. So they're chugging around emitting water, which is great. But there's vast quantities of hydrogen needed to fuel all the ships of the future. Waste, just a quick word on waste. There's been vast reductions so far. That's the second bar. They've got work to do. I won't go into it, but suffice to say, even in 2050, they can't see a way to being zero, so they need some carbon capture and storage. So what's happening with carbon capture and storage? Well, again, of choice, well, let's grow lots of forests. Well, frankly, you can't put in enough forests. There's a group in Cambridge which has been set up to promote the idea, which is more than likely correct, that we can't do enough in net zero to reduce the amount of carbon in the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And therefore we need to, if you like, forcibly take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And that's the new Cambridge Centre, headed up by Sir David King, who was previously a government chief scientific advisor. There's all sorts of other ideas around which will make a small difference, like using more wood in construction. There's BACS, which is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. There's direct air capture of CO2 with storage. Now imagine, let's say we've got 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. You're going to have to process one hell of a lot of the atmosphere to extract the carbon dioxide. It may well turn out that somehow we've got to do that. Leaving that to one side, that's a story for another day. Another idea is biochar. That's a posh word for charcoal. So DAX may be the key option, but it's likely to be very costly. All of this is going to cost money. Which brings us round to power. Now we're talking about needing lots more electricity and generating hydrogen. And these two are sort of inextricably linked. So what's happened? Let's get a picture, first of all, what's happened since 1996. This is a Bayes story. Luckily, coal has pretty much dropped out of UK generation. Renewables, that's the orange line, wind and solar has grown enormously. We're still big users of gas. If we're going to be net zero, gas has to go. And people are talking about much more wind and much more solar. There's good news really on that front. I mean, solar panels now are becoming much more efficient. But unfortunately, here we are in the Northern Hemisphere. The world has not changed. We still get the same amount of energy from the sun that we do at this latitude, like it or not. But it does mean to say that you can now build solar farms and make money on them, even at grid pricing, which is fantastic. wind energy, onshore wind, is actually now the UK's cheapest source of electrical output. There is strong resistance to building more, but the good news is there's lots of potential for building offshore. Now, how much are we going to need? Now this, again, all of these slides basically pinch from other sources, but this is one picture of how much we may need in the future in generating capacity. So these are gigawatts. Currently, we've got about 100, just over 100 gigawatts capacity. For net zero, that NZ is net zero, not New Zealand. It's estimated we need about 260 gigawatts of capacity. So capacity needs to increase dramatically. And you'll see that all the scenarios we're looking at involve wind and photovoltaics and interconnectors. And just as an aside, the question which nobody seems to ask is, we're going to rely on our European friends, who may or may not be friends by then, on their having enough capacity to feed us large quantities of power. Now, supposing Mr. Putin becomes really unreasonable, which is not inconceivable, and starts to cut off gas to Western Europe, the first thing that will happen is there is a shortage of electricity capacity in Europe, and our interconnectors drop to zero. That means to say that we are at risk from relationships with Russia. You know, big strategic issue. Because all the scenarios are looking at interconnectors being a large supplier of marginal power. However, there is good news. Offshore wind power has become much cheaper. If you can see offshore wind from where you are, you'll know there are some big turbines around, and they're not in any big turbines, they're just bloody enormous, these things. They're absolutely huge. So this is from IRENA, again, look it up. This is dollars per megawatt hour. To get this calibrated, we as consumers probably pay in pounds and pence, something like 15p per kilowatt hour, which is 150 pounds per megawatt hour. So offshore wind can generate into the grid at something like 50p, if not less, 40p a kilowatt hour, or 40 pounds a megawatt hour, which is brilliant, except the wind doesn't blow all the time. And of course, the sun doesn't shine all the time, which is a big problem, but again, not insoluble. Now, you might reasonably ask, can you build enough offshore wind? So the Climate Change Committee has looked at this in detail and say, well, actually, there is a technical deployment potential easily of 245 gigawatts. In their scenarios, the 75 gigawatts. With turbine replacement going on, we need to construct at the rate of about 4 gigawatts a year, which is currently double, which will be currently double the current rate. Again, another reasonable question, does that mean to say everywhere offshore is going to be taken up with offshore wind? No, apparently it only needs 5% of the offshore area. Well, so it's good, because it's offshore. There was going to be a very large farm off the south coast of Dorset, which to my mind, being a Dorset person, wouldn't have been unreasonable, but shock horror, you might have seen it from the Jurassic coast, which would have disturbed all the fossils a lot. Anyway, that didn't go ahead. Then, of course, there's nuclear. Well, we're all aware of nuclear, Hinkley Point C. Grid price is currently about 45, 50 pounds a megawatt hour. Hinkley Point C is guaranteed in 2012 money, £92.50 per megawatt hour, which is double the current grid price. £92.50 in today's money, it's probably about £120 a megawatt hour. Do we want any more nuclear? Well, all sorts of issues. Separate conversation. We have another member of Acumen 7, Tony Ralston, who used to run Rolls-Royce Nuclear, and he is in the lead on modular nuclear reactors. And there are some pluses and minuses here. The idea behind this is that why do you need these huge nuclear reactors like Hinkley Point? Because they take forever to build. And those of you who are very familiar, or indeed over familiar with cash flow, will know that if all of your investment is up front for 10 years and you don't get any revenue stream for 10 years, and your discount rate is, let's say, 6 or 7%, it's extremely hard to get a positive net present value. Whereas if you put in, well, a wind turbine, for example, if you put a wind turbine in, you plonk it down into a wind farm and it generates. And you can think about putting in a batch of wind turbines, they generate. You can capitalize the cash flow with Macquarie, for example. There you've got your cash back, your investment cash back. So it becomes extremely quick to get a return on generating capacity, which comes in small chunks very quickly. So a modular reactor, the idea is to have a small reactor which you plug in and make a return on quickly, and then you just add more. So it's like having a plug-in socket. Let's build a socket first, and while you're doing that, you plug the first reactor in. I don't personally go for the idea of having a nuclear reactor in every town and city, mainly because of the security issues. You know, it's just wide open to issues around terrorism and so on. But that's there, that can be done at its very simplest. You could take a Rolls-Royce nuclear reactor, and nobody will tell us how big they are, but I reckon they're about 100 megawatts. You could get nuclear reactors which have been around for years, which are quite cheap, plug them in and off you go. You could have a sort of 2 gigawatt reactor station within a few years. Famous last words. Anyway, we're back to the issue of hydrogen and smart charging. So we're looking here at some work by Aurora Energy, looking at possible output or demand for electricity in half hours. So this is what the grid breaks the day up into, half-hour chunks. So if you have smart charging, it's relatively handleable, 60 gigawatts of load, added to going on 2040 demand. But if you have full electrification, then you obviously need a lot more capacity. So there is a huge trade-off in between full electrification and using hydrogen. And the costings have been done by the Climate Change Committee to look at that. And they're debatable and they need more work. But you can see if you don't change the gas grid to hydrogen, then you need more than twice the electrical generation capacity we've already got. If you do put it in, then you need to generate hydrogen and you need to convert the grid. And the question becomes, how on earth are you going to generate the hydrogen? Well, we all remember back to our basic chemistry lessons. Probably the simplest way of doing it is through electrolysis. You stick 2 electrodes in the water and off bubbles hydrogen and oxygen. That's good, but it's more expensive than through methane reforming. The problem with methane reforming is you're going to produce carbon dioxide. It's not helpful. So you need carbon capture and storage. And we haven't got any carbon capture and storage yet. So we're sort of round the circle again, which is we need some clean hydrogen. So we need lots of electricity to generate the hydrogen so we can all be clean. If I had to put money on this, I would say, and Boris Johnson thinks so incidentally, we're heading for the hydrogen solution. The hydrogen solution, frankly, involves digging up lots of streets, put in plastic pipes, armies of central heating engineers being retrained, to put in air source heat pumps, and so on. Lots and lots of work to do over a time frame. Whoa, you're the guys who are supposed to be able to do this stuff. Project management, Donny, or portfolio management. You know, let's just think of the timeline we need here. Supposing we do have a hydrogen economy and we are net zero by 2050, when people want to pull that forward, 2040, well, what's the life of a central heating boiler? We can't convert them all at once. So they need to be switchable, first of all, so that you put in boilers which can burn methane and then switch to hydrogen through changing the burner. Remember, this was done when we switched from town gas to natural gas. I guess none of you are old enough to remember that being done, but I certainly remember it. In the meantime, the HEVs need to be running around on hydrogen. They've got to be refueled. Industry needs to start to switch to hydrogen. So we need a gas grid pretty damn soon. So the gas grid needs to change to hydrogen 2030, 2035. So although you can operate it regionally, luckily, in reality, the grid can only really be gas or hydrogen. It can't be mixed. It has to be one or the other. And somebody somewhere, as in the Prime Minister and his cabinet, need to make that decision pretty damn soon. And companies themselves, in my view, need to start doing the planning for this. Because if your company burns gas, it's not going to be burning gas in the future, it's going to be burning hydrogen, or it may be using electricity. So we need to start now. And finally, if there's anybody in the oil industry out there, or if you're an investor, would you be buying Shell and BP shares right now? You know, these are what are called stranded assets, and the smart investors are beginning to sell. And it's not a pretty sight, and it will become less of a pretty sight as we go into the next 5 years or so. So I guess that's the end of my, what's the single of a diatribe? I suppose a monotribe, a rant over 25 minutes. Well, it's rather longer than that, sorry. But here we are. We need to do some stuff and we need to start thinking about it. So over to you, Donny.